Hey, welcome back everybody. So we got 2 videos to go and then we'll be done for the year. We'll only have the last reflection project to finish the year out. And we're going to talk today about the influence of the individual historian on the crafting of academic history. So I may need part of the last video to do this, but I'm going to try to get through the perspectives on the purpose of writing history and studying history, and something that would fall under perspectives on the purpose of history would be the schools of historiography. So there are different philosophies about how history should be written, how history should be interpreted and studied and constructed. And the kind of attitudes about scholarship production in history are very relevant to TOK. So here we can see a quote by John Betchman, a historian, arguing that history must not be written with bias and both sides must be given even if there is only one side. Kind of a paradoxical quote, but how true do you think this is? One of the interesting questions that comes up in TOK history is to what extent subjectivity actually determines the way history is written. Because think about it, the individual historian has to decide the topic that they're investigating, the sources that they choose, and then how they interpret those sources, and even how they actually interpret the language and the nature of what the source is reporting. After all, from one perspective, a terrorist could very easily be considered a freedom fighter, and in opposition perspective, it could be considered something that's a radical rebellion, threat to the rule of law, etc., etc. So a lot of history is very weighted with interpretation, and it's very hard to try to unpack how historians actually package the past into a consumable form of knowledge. So there are a couple of schools of thought on this question. One of them is a little bit more scientific, and it was more popular in the late 1800s. And it was called historicism. And the argument was that history must be like a science. We have to use history in the same way that we use empirical science with hypothesis testing and experimentation. And by trying to look at several different perspectives and trying to gather information and use a kind of scientific testing, we can actually try to provide an accurate and complete vision of what really happened. So this was really popular with the Belgian, I believe, who's a Belgian historian, Leopold von Ranke, and his argument was that we need to bring the scientific method to the study of history. And he thought that we could show history as it really happened, as it really was. Well, this prompted a lot of reaction, and in the 20th century, postmodernism has become a much more popular way to kind of look at the study of history. Now, postmodernism is a weird word. It was originally a word that came out of art. It got applied to philosophy. It gets applied all over the place. A lot of postmodernists, if you ask them if they're postmodern, will say, no, I'm not a postmodernist. Post-structuralist, there's all different kinds of terms that this gets overlapped with. So it can be kind of confusing, but I want to kind of focus on the perspective of Friedrich Nietzsche. So Nietzsche, as I'm going to show you in the next slide, thought of history more as an art form, and through the use of things like philology, through the interrogation of old languages and where words come from, and the use of genealogy, a kind of method of interrogating how power sources help to influence how history is written, he kind of said this argument that historical sources are basically incoherent and incomprehensible. And this was carried further in the 20th century by the very famous French philosopher Michel Foucault, who also wrote several histories. You may even call him more of a historian than a philosopher. But he wrote several histories basically pointing this out, that many of the historical sources are written by the people in power and are embedded with the perspective of the ruling class in power. And this became a very popular method of interrogation, a very popular method of critiquing history, of critiquing sources. And while you might think that this leads to a kind of lack of knowledge in general, this is not really the aim of a lot of the postmodernists. I think very often they become quite ethical and become quite concerned with power sources and how they influence knowledge. Michel Foucault is very critical of this, and he thought it was a grave danger, not necessarily one that was always bad, that people had power to kind of construct our knowledge, but one that must be criticized, that we have to see the general instability of knowledge and language as a kind of paradigm for the earth, that we cannot apply this universal perspective anymore. So I wonder, do you think history is more of an art or more of a science? Uh, Genealogy, typically, we use this word today in pop culture to refer to a study of family, like Ancestry.com, right? But in philosophy, genealogy refers to something much more specific. It's a method that assumes that historical knowledge cannot be detached from the power structures that actually shape the recording of history. So this includes like the language that's being used, the perspective, the political, economic, social structures that were all embedded into the people that are actually recording the history. And so the genealogist's attempt is to try to uncover what influence that power had on the reporting of history. So this is very, very difficult. But we can kind of get some ideas about maybe some misconceptions that we might have. And that's what critique and genealogy is really useful for. It's about pointing out some of the flaws in our assumptions, some of the flaws in our thinking. It's not necessarily great for constructing truth, but it's important to be a critic and ask those questions to make sure that we're aiming for the best possible truth. Constructive doubt, right? The purpose of theory of knowledge. We talked about that. So the guy who really became the primary influence of genealogists was Friedrich Nietzsche, and this was not happening while he was alive. He did not become influential until after his death. But he really pioneered a kind of genealogy, and his basic presumption was that history was a long, slow, and complicated process, and that ruling classes essentially shaped the knowledge of people, the way that they understand, especially ethics. So he wrote a book in, I think it's 1878 or 1886, somewhere in there, 1870s, 1880s, called The Genealogy of Morals, and really reframed how we thought about morality. And he said, first, humans, especially in Europe, humans had a morality based on kind of more animalistic. If you look at the ancient cultures and the philology of ancient Greece and Rome, which Nietzsche was an academic expert in, he was a professor of philology by the age of 23. His argument was that ancient languages showed that classical cultures, ancient cultures, embraced a kind of animalistic pride. You know, we would conquer, we would win, and celebrate that. And gradually over time, the less powerful class, the priestly class, came to twist the values around and celebrate people who were poor and without stuff as being chaste and self-sacrificing. And he thought Judeo-Christian ethics had really inverted morality. And he does this by paying very close attention to the development of words. So he looks at words like debt and punishment and guilt and where they come from, their historic origins, their Sanskrit origins sometimes, where these words come from. And he really, really upended notions about what universal ideas had been held by Europeans in the 1800s. So for example, the notion of justice, he traced back to words about debt and repayment, that essentially if someone lent somebody money or some object and was not repaid, they expected some kind of revenge, some kind of punishment. And he said this was really the foundation of our criminal justice system, was this very animalistic impulse towards revenge, that we seek a pound of flesh in exchange for an unpaid debt. And he does this by very, very carefully tracing the use of words that you find in the law, in Greco-Roman codes of law, for example. Now, another really influential historical thinker was George Orwell. You probably know George Orwell, although his actual name was Eric Blair, as a writer and author of books like Animal Farm in 1984. And he actually really was influential in postmodernism, mainly because these works of fiction were criticisms of the state and the state apparatus. Now, George Orwell, his background, he had been a soldier and was a British officer in Imperial India, and he saw the oppression of the people in India and was inspired to speak truth to power. And he did it through fiction. He did it through very specifically polemic fiction and a dystopian kind of vision. Now, polemic is a method of writing history that is opinionated. It is usually very angry. It is usually like Howard Zinn is a polemic historian. Admittedly, he would call himself a polemicist. He is trying to write a narrative of someone who is oppressed in history, not celebrating stuff, but very, very kind of angry. And George Orwell was doing the same thing. And what he did was he invented some of the language of postmodernism, like Orwellian, groupthink, doublethink, Big Brother, thought police, thought crime. All these things come out of 1984. But one of the things that is brilliant, and one of the things I would probably have you do if we were in the classroom, is read, or at least reread, the chapter where the character Siam describes his job at the Ministry of Language, where he's just deleting words, or the Ministry of Information. I forget what the title of the agency was, but his job was to delete words and simplify thinking. And this was really, really not only linked well with the notion of genealogy in Nietzsche, but this brilliant kind of thesis about history is that if you close off the language that people can use, you lock what the philosopher Zizek would call, you lock us into a map of ideological coordinates that we can't think outside of. And that can be a really, really powerful form of tyranny without people even necessarily knowing it. You can get people to consent to their own oppression if you can shape their thinking in particular ways. And the main way that you do that is through language. And George Orwell was brilliant at pointing that out. But again, both Nietzsche and Orwell would point towards a very unstable notion of history, that history is more of an art form and more of a reflection of personal bias and power structures than actual historical events and truth. Now, one example where you can see this, though, this kind of this critique in action, is in the question of women's equality. Now, I could show you this primary source. If I can find it, I will link it. But it's by a pretty influential French thinker from the 1700s, trying to argue with some really convoluted mathematical equations about why women were inferior. And what he was trying to prove, that it was a product of natural law, that it was nature. But genealogists would come along and kind of attack this and say, first off, these natural laws came from an ancient society that protected women because their birthing abilities were like a superpower. And giving birth was so important in tribal societies that they would not let women join into the hunting and fighting. This is from the philosopher from the University of Denver, Ken Wilber, in the book Philosophy of Everything. Also, feminist Sheila Jeffreys would argue that women were the powerful religious leaders in the more polytheistic cultures and the more pagan, witchcraft-driven, what you might think of as witchcraft, not in the negative way, but in the kind of classical pre-Christian religion. The nature worship is what Christians might call it. But women were very often the priestesses. And it's the monotheisms that came along and really suppressed the role of women. So this argument about it being a product of natural law and following some universal mathematical code that transcends all personal bias, which was kind of very in line with the 1700s and 1800s Eurocentric thinking, that reason can bring us to the one perfect answer. These genealogists are coming along and showing the bias inherent in that history. All right, so here's a knowledge question. To what extent, although it's kind of more subject specific, so we would have to broaden this and make it a little more general. To what extent does the perception and the intentions of the historian, or you could say in a more general sense, the actual reporter of knowledge, influence our understanding of that knowledge? So does reading a particular historian, does sitting in a particular history teacher's class necessarily mean that you're going to have a particular perspective of history? Most of the political science evidence shows that your biggest influence on your political values or your interpretation of history, for that matter, is your family. But others can have a huge influence as well. But think about it. How much you actually construct arguments for this? All right, so we didn't get to the schools of historiography today. I promise next time I'll cover the schools of historiography, tie a neat little bow on this. We'll do one last closing kind of reflection, and the year will be done. I love you guys. I miss you all. And I hope to see you soon. Take care, everybody.